Hello friends, welcome to the channel IT Simplified. In today's session, we'll discuss what Azure Data Factory is and what components make this service. So let's get started. Like always, if you're liking these sessions, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this content. So let's start with defining what Azure Data Factory is. So first of all, Azure Data Factory, also known as ADF, is a fully managed cloud service which allows you to create workflows for orchestrating your data movement and transforming your data at scale. Now, ADF is typically associated with big data analytics, and another term that you typically associate with ADF is ETL or ELT, which stands for extract, transform, and load, or extract, load, and transform. Now, which option to choose from will depend upon different scenarios, but let's try to understand what exactly each of this term means, right? So let's start with extract and we'll go into transform and then we'll go into load. And in order to explain this, let me take an example so that you can correlate with that, right? So let's say you have an on-prem application. Now this is a gaming app, right? And this app is generating logs. You might be having on-prem database maybe, right? But let's say this application is generating logs, right? This is a very big application and you want to make sense of this data which is being generated here, right? So for that, you need to have some sort of mechanism, right, where you can load this data, right? So this logs are getting generated by this gaming applications, right, which is sitting in on your on-prem environment, right? And you need to load that data, right? So that's where the extraction will come into play. Now you can load this data, for example, into a blob storage, right? So you need to copy that data. That's where the extraction will come into play, right? So you're moving the data from on-prem into some sort of storage, and that's where the copying is done. That's where the extraction, and that is what extract means in ETL, right? Now, once this data is loaded to a blob storage, now this is the raw data, right? Now, transformation includes different steps, right? So there is a cleaning which happens. Now, when I say raw data, it means that it might not have any structure to it, right? So that data needs to be cleaned. So it might be having some missing values in it, right? Inconsistencies. So in this step, all this cleaning will take place, right? Now, another step that can be associated within transformation is the deduplication. Now, as I mentioned, this is typically associated with big data. So we're dealing with massive amount of data, right? And if you try to copy the same data over and over again, right, it can consume a lot of storage and at the same time a lot of underlying resources, because as you mentioned, as you remember, I mentioned that Azure Data Factory is a fully managed cloud service. So it means that the underlying infrastructure to which typically a cost is associated is taken care by Microsoft in this case, right? So if you're copying the data again and again, right, so it can consume a lot of resources and also delay a lot of different activities, and we'll discuss that uh, in a moment, right? So deduplication is also part of the transformation. Now, another step that can be associated is the sorting, right? The transformation. Now, once the data is clean, deduplicated, now this data needs to be organized according to its type, right? And that is what happens during the sorting process. So these are some of the activity I can say is associated under the transformation, right? So extract, you copy the data. Transformation includes cleaning, deduplication, sorting the data. And once the transformation has taken place, it needs to be loaded. For example, if I load this to an maybe Azure SQL, right? And the loading can be of two type. You can have a full loading, or you can have an incremental loading. Now, what is the difference between the two? Now, as the name suggests, whenever there is a transformation which is taken place in the full loading, every time a transformation is taken place, uh, the data is fully loaded and a unique value is created in your Azure SQL database every time, right? In the full loading, as the name suggests. Now that is okay, but you need to also keep an eye because your data can grow exponentially. But that is what the full loading means, right? And in the incremental loading, it means that only the change which has happened from the last transformation, only those values are added in the incremental loading. So that's the difference between the two. But this is all part of the loading process. So we have copied the data maybe from on-prem databases, all these logs, under the extraction process to blob storage. Then the transformation has taken place over here, right? And then the data has been loaded to, say, for example, to an Azure SQL. And there are two kinds of loading, as I mentioned, that you have a full loading and you have a incremental loading. And after that has taken place, right, you need to publish this, right? And you can publish this to a tool, maybe sort of Power BI. Now, what is the idea behind this, right? Because as I mentioned that these data can be in an unstructured format, which does not make sense. So the whole idea about this process is that as an organization, I want to make business sense of what my data so that I can take intelligent decision. Maybe I want to have, based on this information, let's say I want to develop my marketing plan, right? Based on this, I want to know which age group is using this application, right? Which demography or which country is utilizing this application more. So maybe I can target that, right? So all this will be only possible if I have some sort of mechanism which I can utilize so that I can make sense of this. And that is where the whole ETL process will come into play, right? And that is what constitutes the Azure Data Factory. And all the compute resources which are typically required to carry out this is hosted in the cloud, and Microsoft is responsible for managing this, right? Hope this makes sense when it comes to Azure Data Factory. Now let's shift gear a bit and let's try to understand what are the different services which are involved when it comes to Azure Data Factory and some of the terminologies and the terms which will help you understanding this whole scenario, right? And I've listed this over here, right? So you have these are the components. So you have pipelines, you have activities, data sets, link services, integration runtime, and trigger. So let's look at this one by one, starting with pipelines and activities. So pipeline is nothing but logical grouping of different activities, right? So this can be activity one, this can be activity two, this can be activity three, and this is all logical grouping which constitute a pipeline, right? Now the question arises, what actually is a activity, right? So let's look at that too. Uh, Let me say, and let's take an example of again the blob storage, right? So I have the data in a blob, right? I'm moving the data or transforming the data maybe to an Azure SQL, right? And the data has been moved from, say, from a database on-prem, right? So I'm copying the data. So copy can be one activity, transformation can be another activity, right? And I'm loading the data or syncing the data, that is can be considered as another activity. So that is where the pipeline and the activities comes into play. So pipeline is again nothing but logical grouping of the activities, and activities can be copying, loading, transforming, right? All these constitute different activities, and you can have one or you can have multiple pipelines uh, within an Azure Data Factory implementation. But that is how the pipeline and the activities are correlated. Hopefully that makes sense of the explanation that I made. Then you have the data sets, right? And again, taking the example, so data sets are nothing but as they represent the data structure within the data store. Now, again, taking this example, right? So if I have to say what is the data store in this one, a blob copy can be one data store, and Azure SQL can be another data store. So it's basically the data sets which represent the data structure within the data store, right? So this can be the source, this can be the sink, right? But this is where we are loading the data and then copying the data and then ultimately loading it. So that can be represented as the data sets within an Azure Data Factory, right? So this is what pipeline activity and data sets is. Let's look at link services. Now this is very important, right? So when we talk about link services, when we are talking about blob or SQL on-prem databases, right? You need to connect to those services, right? And for example, if you are dealing with, say, for example, databases, then you know that you need to deal with maybe connection strings, right? If I dealing with blob storage, then a key and a password is generated, or maybe a SAT, which stands for shared access signature. So basically, link services are like your connection strings, right? That's the way you're connecting to those data sets so that you can create those pipeline and ultimately the activities can happen with that, right? So that is where the link services come into play. Those are basically the connection strings, right? And hopefully you're able to connect the dots over here, right? So pipeline is logical grouping of your different activities. Activities includes copying, loading, transforming. Data sets are where you're storing that particular data. For example, if you're copying the data to a blob storage and then ultimately loading it to Azure SQL, those will be the data sets. Link services are your connection strings, the way you are connecting to those data sets. And now you have the integration runtime, and this is very important because that is where your most of the cost will come into play when it comes to Azure Data Factory implementation. So what is basically integration runtime? So integration runtime is actually the bridge between your, let me choose maybe another color here. So it is basically the bridge between your activity and your linked services. This acts as a bridge. Now, this is the compute environment where your activity is going to run, and you will look into the integration runtime now when I do the other part. So this is the part one. When I do the second part in which we are going to create an Azure Data Factory pipeline, right, you will see what that link services is. But the important thing I want to point out here is that the link services are of three kinds. You have Azure link service, you have self-hosted link services, and you have Azure SIS or SQL Service Integration Services, right? So what does that, all of them, they mean, right? So first of all, Azure Link Services. So Azure Link Services means that, or Azure, sorry, my bad, Azure Integration Runtime. Right, so we are talking about integration runtime. So what does Azure Integration Runtime means? For example, if I'm moving the data between the Azure services, so say for example, if I have a data in the blob storage and I'm moving that to the Azure SQL database as a service, that can be termed as Azure Integration Runtime. So I'm moving the data between the Azure services, right? So that is where. Now you might come across a scenario in which is very common, in which you are trying to move the data. In this example, which I took, right? I have this on-prem application. It has a database. It is generating logs. So in this case, I'm moving the data, say for example, from this on-prem into blob, and then transforming it and loading it to the to an Azure SQL. That can be termed as self-hosted integration runtime, right? Because I'm moving the data, say in this case, from on-prem into Azure services. Basically, you need to drop an agent to those so that we can talk to that on-prem environment, right? But that is where the Azure self-hosted integration runtime will come into play. And then you have Azure SQL Server Integration Services runtime, right? Now, SQL Server Integration Services is an ETL tool which is typically used on-prem, right? So if you're dealing with your on-prem ETL processes, it might be familiar to you, right? And when you do that, an SSIS package, SQL Server Integration Services package is created, right? Now, when we talk about Azure SSIS, this is used to lift and shift your existing SSIS workload. Now, you can create this runtime integration runtime to natively execute your SSIS packages, right? But that is where this will come into play. So if you're dealing with the ETL processes typically on-prem, so this might sound familiar to you. But the important thing is that these are the three different options available when it comes to integration runtime. If you're dealing with the data within the cloud only, then you're going to use first option. If you're moving the data, for example, or creating pipeline from on-prem application into cloud, maybe, right, then self-hosted integration runtime. And if you're already using some sort of ETL tool, for example, the SQL Server Integration Services on-prem, and you want to maybe leverage now and execute those packages, you can use Azure SSIS integration runtime to lift and shift those packages, right? So that is what constitute the integration runtime. Hopefully it makes sense. And then finally you have trigger, right? Let's look at the trigger too. Now this is also very important. So trigger are also of three types. First of all, trigger is some sort of scheduling mechanism. This is all again part of all Azure Data Factory tool that you get, and you get everything from the GUI that you can manage, right? So basically scheduling when your pipeline is going to start activities like copying the data, right? So scheduling mechanism that's going to happen, which can happen on a daily, weekly, hourly basis, right? But this trigger is of three kinds, right? So you have the schedule trigger, then you also have the tumbling window trigger, and then you have an event-based trigger. Now, schedule trigger is very common, right? So this is basically, as the name suggests, you want to schedule those activities, right? When that execution, copying, loading, transforming, those kind of stuff happens on a specific time of the day or during when you want to run it, maybe during the off-peak hours, right? Maybe in the night. That's where you're going to configure the scheduling trigger. Now you also have the tumbling windows trigger. Now this is basically used when you're trying to move the data or replicate the data, for example, from on your on-prem database into, say, into an Azure data lake, and you want to run this on a specific hours, but you want to create a separate file and folder every time that execution takes place. For that kind of activity, you can configure something what you call a tumbling window trigger, right? This is also used when you're dealing with historical data, basically. And then you have the event-based trigger. So basically, depending upon if some event has happened with your data sets, right, or maybe with your on-prem application, right, and at that time you want to trigger those activities, that is where the event-based trigger will come into play. But trigger is also important, and you get all these things from the Azure Data Factory, which is a GUI tool that you get from the Azure, and then you can schedule those based on your requirement. But the important thing is that these are the different components which are involved when it comes to Azure Data Factory, like pipeline, activity, dataset, link services, integration, runtime, and trigger. But the big picture is that this is an ETL or ELT tool, extract, transform, load, or extract, load, and transform, load. And the whole idea behind this drill is that you want to make business sense of your applications and the data which is being generated so that you can use it for your own benefit, for your own organizational need. You can make intelligent decision on the basis of that data, which typically sometimes is not human readable, right? Those logs, right? And you want to make sense of that to maybe improve your overall efficiency of your organization, develop maybe marketing plan, target specific age group if they are buying certain products, right? To run campaigns, and if you are getting maybe more sales maybe from a specific geography, what is working over there, and maybe if it is not working somewhere else, right? So there are different ways you can utilize this data, but you need some sort of mechanism or a tool which you through which you can gather this information and publish that to a Power BI or some other tool. So this is what Azure Data Factory is in a nutshell. Hopefully